What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? So tonight we have a debate between me and Ross Burns. I've got Skylar Fiction, who's going to be moderating. So I'm going to let Skylar take it away real quick. But if you guys are on the other side of this question before the debate and afterwards you agree with my side, there's a petition in the description if you want to hit that up and sign the petition to help us protect the Aboriginals in Australia. Then it would be a great help to go and do that. But in any case, I hope that you guys will consider liking this and sharing it out if you enjoyed the conversation. And so now I'm going to let Skylar take it. So take it away, Skylar.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Skylar Fiction from the Skylar Fiction Show. Thank you for having me on tonight to get to moderate you guys. I'm super excited to be on here. So tonight's topic of debate is evangelizing to Indigenous people. I believe G is going to be taking the position that you should not do it, would be my guess. And Ross Burns is going to take the position that is perfectly fine, too. So we've got a basic little format for the debate. We're going to do 10-minute openings, and then we will do, I believe, 5-minute rebuttals, I believe. And then we're going to have a 30 minutes of just kind of a discussion between the two, open discussion, and we'll do some closing. And if you guys have any questions when we get to the Q&A, we'll ask for questions from the audience, and we look forward to having our guests answer them. So I guess we can get it started. So thanks, guys, everybody, for watching. Tell you what, why don't we, John, I believe we're going to go with you first since you are taking the affirmative. And I will start your clock now.
Had myself muted. There we go. All right. So first, I want to say thank you to Skylar for moderating, and everybody should subscribe to Skylar. And also thanks to Ross for having the debate, for wanting the debate. So thank you, Ross. First up, what I want to do is kind of lay out my points as to why Christians should definitely be banned from evangelizing to Indigenous people. First, in this particular context, Christians are not concerned with the actual well-being of a group of people. They are only concerned with adding another soul to their list of saved people. And in this invasion of another culture and subsequent disruption of their society, it has real world negative effects associated with them, including the devastation of entire tribes and severe culture shock, as well as the abuse of both the Indigenous people and the missionary or evangelical children. So, first up, philosophically, the goal of a missionary is not to help the Indigenous people. They use certain actions to gain the trust of the Indigenous people so that they can use that trust to convert them to Christianity. It's a subversive way of colonizing the minds of people that shouldn't be colonized. Caitlin Lowry used to be a missionary, and after the John Allen Chau was killed while trying to evangelize to the Sentinelese people, she reflected on her time as a missionary. She said, quote, "I used to be a missionary. I would go on short-term mission trips to Eastern Europe or Africa for the sole purpose of earning souls for Christ. We kept count of the number of people we saved. We put on a play or volunteered for a little while to show our love for Jesus. Then after praying with them and adding their soul to the tally marks, we would never see them again. Ask me what their names were. I must have worked with and met hundreds of people. I do remember, do I remember who they were? Did I even attempt to keep in contact with them or show them that I still care after they'd been added to the notches on my cross? No, not even once." End quote. The ultimate goal of most evangelists and missionaries is to continue to add notches to their cross because they are only concerned with how they make themselves feel. We will see how this narcissistic mindset has devastating real-world effects later. Evangelists and missionaries are only focused on what happens to people after they die and not what evangelists and missionaries can actually do now to help the people they preach to. Instead of providing food and water, they provide Bibles. Instead of learning about their culture and protecting their way of life, they seek to destroy their cultural identity and replace it with Christian identity and way of life. If your goal is to actually help Indigenous people, there are secular ways of doing just that. Groups like the Amazon Conservation Team work with the local governments to protect the Indigenous people and provide them help that they actually need. Nobody needs their way of life disrupted or destroyed because someone considers it to be insufficient based on their subjective opinion about an afterlife. Now, the real world effects of evangelizing to Indigenous people. As I mentioned before, there are several negative real world effects that are directly caused by evangelizing to Indigenous people. As I said before, evangelists and missionaries use a shallow, surface-level attempt to help Indigenous people in order to gain their trust. As an example, Wycliffe Bible translators exchange essential services like transportation, education, medical assistance around the world for an unrestricted license to evangelize their faith to tribes of Indigenous people. As a result, they show very little respect to the culture and society of these tribes. This undermines the confidence of these Indigenous people by destroying their beliefs and replacing them with the evangelists' beliefs. Stephanie Finns describes the effects of evangelists on the, I'm going to butcher this name, but Machihuenga people of Peru as drastically shifting their status systems, inequalities, and created a dependency on Western goods. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team discusses the devastating effects of missionaries on the Curacao people in Suriname from 1969 to 1971. In just 2 years, nearly 50% of the population lost their lives to upper respiratory diseases and culture shock. He claims that he can lump missionaries and evangelicals into one of two groups: those who want to prepare these tribes for the outside world, and those that want to save some souls for Jesus. Ripping someone out of their native culture, robbing them of their belief system, and effectively destroying their culture is not the best thing for Indigenous people. And if you think that they don't destroy cultures and beliefs, just take a look at what happened to Liberia. When missionaries brought Christianity to Liberia, cloaked with a helping hand, they radically changed the culture of the entire country. Soon after, there were so many churches that the native beliefs were in the minority. Christians will look at this and think about how awesome God is and how great it is to see God permeating a society. What they really should see is how a culture was fossilized by an invading Western Christian culture. Christianity became central to its positions of power, and even their government changed to become a carbon copy of the United States, complete with a Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and a Bill of Rights. Their flag is the exact same as the United States, except it's only got one star. That is colonialism. Caitlin Lowry, the ex-missionary that I quoted earlier, had this to say about her attitude towards the Indigenous peoples that she ministered to. Quote, "I prayed over their houses of worship that they would repent and see that their faith was dead. Yet I never once sat down and asked to learn what they believed. Why did I assume that my faith was the right faith? Why did I assume that my presence was so precious that it would change their hearts and lives? Why did I assume that they were lost, living their beautiful, content lives right where they were? Why did I assume their lives needed changing?" End quote. Missionaries and evangelicals will do whatever it takes to spread their faith, even if it means utterly destroying an entire culture to do so. If you don't recall, the conquistadors that landed in the Americas had the same goals as the missionaries do now: to colonize the savages, to bring them to civilization. They did this because they thought their way was better than the native people, just like the missionary and evangelicals now. All they do is bring sickness and subversion and a subversive hand with which to help them. How much time do I have, Skylar? Oh, I can't. You're muted.
About 2 minutes left.
2 minutes.
Sorry.
Okay. So right here at the end, what I'll add is that there's also another victim in the missionary and evangelical life, and that would be the children of the evangelicals. Because what happens to them is they are sent off to boarding schools, or they're even taught within the communities that their parents are serving. But the problem is that there's even less regulation over the missionaries and evangelicals that are on these missions. They get sexually abused all the time, just as much as they do here in the States in their own churches. Abroad, they are abused by even their own parents. And like I said before, the evangelicals and missionaries abuse the trust that is given to them by the indigenous people. So I think I'll cede the rest of my time. And I appreciate everybody's time to listening to me. And I guess I will hand it over to Ross.
Thank you, my friend. Ross, are you ready, my friend?
I sure am.
All right, I'm going to start your clock now.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks. My name's Ross Burns. I have a YouTube channel called Burns Eye View. I think it's in the description below, so you can check it out if you'd like anytime. But thanks so much to John for having me on, and Skylar for moderating. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm just going to jump right in. So I'm taking the negative position that there should not be a ban on Christian missionaries evangelizing indigenous peoples. And I'm going to give 4 reasons for doing that, or for taking that position, rather. One, I'm just going to show my cards here. I'm not a neutral or unbiased participant in this conversation. I'm a Christian, a rather obnoxious Christian too, a Calvinist and a post-millennialist. So, like the worst of all worlds as far as Christianity goes. So I believe that all individuals living in people groups unreached by the gospel are lost. I'm not an inclusivist. I believe that they need to hear and understand the gospel and to experience new birth, to experience conversion from God, or else they'll be judged on the last day. And while I do believe God has ordained a group of people from all tribes, tongues, nations, languages, etc., I believe that He's also ordained the means of each individual's conversion, which is the preaching of the gospel. So that's the first point. I have a theological reason for not preferring a ban. The second reason I'm going to suggest is there's some tremendous political problems with a proposed ban on Christian evangelism in indigenous cultures. I would be interested in the legislative idea behind this, how this would actually get implemented. I'm hoping something like the UN wouldn't be in charge of who can and can't share their ideas across cultures. That would probably be a thing the UN shouldn't have the authority to do. So I'm assuming it would be each individual country would be responsible for making this kind of ban. In which case, I would just say that would be a tremendous restriction of religious freedom. I believe that individuals should be able to proselytize whomever they want, whenever they want, and government shouldn't legislate against rudeness. That's not the government's job. Now, I'm not defending forced entry or harassment or anything like that. A good example would be if tomorrow morning I have 2 nice young men with Mormon missionary name tags on their door, and they're knocking on my front door, and I'm busy, so I say no, thank you, and they were just barged their way into my house. That's not cool. I'm not defending that kind of way of evangelizing, but I think the Mormons should be able to knock on my door every morning if they so choose, even though it's very irritating to me. And I would defend a Muslim or a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness in their evangelistic efforts as well. I think they should have the freedom to do so. So that would be the political reason for my taking the negative position. Thirdly, philosophical issue. That all culturally held beliefs, values, and worldviews are not equal. So let me just repeat that one more time. all culturally held beliefs, values, and worldviews are not equal. So that a cultural worldview or value system can be improved upon. And I think we actually all intuitively believe this. For instance, I would imagine that John would be very happy to go to an indigenous culture and give them some kind of seminar on valuing women, of a good role of honoring women in society, of something in like feminist values, something like that, or the value of a scientific method of knowing what's true. The testing hypotheses and experimenting, all that kind of stuff. I imagine that we would all say, yeah, that's great. Let's get that into as many indigenous cultures as possible. So we do believe that there are many cultures in the world that whose values should be improved upon, and they're generally held worldviews. And the cultural mixing is something that, if we really want to prevent it, then we should just ban all Western interaction with cultures. So things like philabundance or World Health Organization should also be banned from contacting indigenous cultures, which I think would be an awful thing. The further thing is a ban on proselytizing is a self-refuting standard. Here's what I mean by that. So if the standard is no one should seek to change another person's way of thinking, let's test that out in a couple situations. So George thinks that pierogies are the best possible dinner, and Sam thinks that tacos are the best possible dinner. Now, obviously, Sam is right, but the standard would be that George shouldn't try to convince Sam that his idea of the best possible dinner is wrong. That just, their culturally held beliefs are both equal. Neither is right, neither is wrong. That's fine. But what about someone who holds the cultural belief, that they should evangelize indigenous peoples? Now, the standard says we shouldn't try to seek to change their way of thinking. So according to the standard, it can't be applied to the evangelizing of indigenous peoples. The evangelical notion that we're supposed to go and make disciples of all nations is something protected under this clause. So the point is to point out the incoherence of trying to convince people to stop trying to convince people, right? That's the point. And I would also point out that John has an entire YouTube channel dedicated to changing people's way of thinking. And I fully support him in that. I think he should have that. And if anybody suggested a ban on his ability to do so, I'd be right alongside him defending his rights to express his views and to try and change people's minds. And then lastly, I want to clarify, I don't support the destruction of culture. I support the transformation of culture. And in order to make that a distinction with a difference, I'm going to give you the example of the Sawi people. The Sawi people were a tribe or still are a tribe, in Western New Guinea, the far west side of Indonesia above Australia. And they were a tribe who enjoyed fun pastimes like headhunting and cannibalism. And one of their chief values in their culture was treachery. So if you could infiltrate another tribe and gain their trust and then deceive them, that was a prized virtue. And they were a constant war with the various subgroups within the Sawi ethnicity. They were riddled with malaria and hepatitis, and they couldn't maintain any population growth from things like newborn deaths and all that kind of stuff. So I believe Canadian missionary family, the Richardsons, moved in with them, lived with them. They spent years with them. They built a hospital, if you can call it that, there. They treated so many people for malaria and hepatitis, genuinely wanting to save their lives because it was a medical emergency that they received Western medicine. And they worked on translating the New Testament into their language, which was quite a task. Their language had over, I think, about 19 different tenses for all verbs. That's absurd. Like, that's just a terrible way to make a language. In the 1960s, virtually all of Mosawi is converted to Christianity. Now they have peace with their neighboring tribal groups. They're actually active citizens involved in the Indonesian government. Some of them are employees of the Indonesian government, but they're not American. Well, they're not Canadian Christians, right? So that would be the destruction of culture, which has happened many times, as John pointed out. Turning Indigenous people into American Christians or Canadian Christians, who prize values like capitalism, and they have Republican Party bumper stickers on their wagons. Like, that would be a destruction of culture. They still have values that are non-Western values, like respecting your elders. They're not overly materialistic or individualistic. They have many values that they have we should adopt, right? So destruction of culture is not something that I advocate for or support in any way. The transformation of culture, taking the bad things of their culture and replacing it with good Christian values, is what I do support. So just to summarize, the 4 points that I made were: I have a theological reason for rejecting the thesis, a political one, a philosophical one, and then lastly an experiential one, that it really does work. And
that's time. Perfect timing there. All right, so let me reset this clock. We're gonna do 5-minute rebuttals. John, are you feeling good? You ready to go? All right,
Yep,
my man.
I'm good.
You could go ahead and go, my man.
All right. So thank you, Ross, for your point of view there. So I'm going to go through your list from the first thing that you said to the last, that they need to hear the gospel in order to be saved in the afterlife. And I guess what I would say to that is, I mean, that's just kind of your opinion, what happens in the afterlife. There's no solid evidence to suggest that your opinion is the correct opinion about what happens in the afterlife. But also, that being your paramount reason, the first one on your list, kind of highlights something that I said, in that you're not really concerned with the well-being of the Indigenous people. It doesn't really seem like you're concerned with bettering their society, but bettering their position or anything like that. The paramount thing that you're concerned with is evangelizing your gospel, making sure that you can just add another notch onto your saved souls list, is what that says to me. You may disagree with that, but the fact that that's at the top of your list really does drive home one of my points in my opening. And then you talked about political problems, namely like who would enforce these laws and such. Now, already the laws are pretty individualistic to each country, primarily because it's the country itself that is protecting its Indigenous people. It would like for right now in our current contemporary time frame, it would be like tasking the UN, like you were trying to suggest, with protecting the Native Americans, which arguably you can make a solid case that maybe we should have had some outside insight on how to protect the Indigenous peoples of North America. That would have, in hindsight's 2020, seemed like that might have been a better idea. But the fact is that it would be individual to each country. But I also don't see this as like a slight against Christians or anybody that's wanting to spread their ideas through a community or society or culture. What you're talking about here is taking your ideas and forcefully putting them into a different society and culture, and in the hopes of not necessarily changing them for the good or bad, but just changing them for your way, which you perceive as good, but you're ultimately saying, well, your way is worse than my way. And ultimately, that's just an opinion, and it also would destroy the culture of that civilization if you stumbled upon it. I also don't think that it's a restriction of freedom to protect Indigenous peoples from the influence of religious people that seek to take advantage of the Indigenous peoples, of how ignorant they are, or how uneducated they are, in order to convince them to come to your faith, so that you can just keep colonizing these different Indigenous peoples out there. So number 3 on your list, that all beliefs are not equal. I would agree, but that in and of itself is a subjective statement, that all beliefs are not equal. You would say that your belief in God and Christianity would be much better than my belief, or any one of my beliefs, I guess. But also, like Islam, you would think that your way is better than Islam, I would assume. And so you can see how it's a very subjective thing. But you swing to extremes here, saying that you would need to like ban all interactions with like other societies, I guess, like ban interactions between societies. This is where a bit of the nuance comes in, and that I didn't exactly highlight in my opening, but that there is a way to help Indigenous people through secular means to actually affect changes that better their position or make them healthier or whatnot. But you have to understand that most of the missionary, at least from my own research, I was never a missionary kid, so this is like me researching the information. It seems like most of the missionary work is not long-term missionary, long-term live-in missionary work. It seems to be a lot of missionary work that has one particular project in mind. And what happens is that these kids, they'll go into the country, and like Caitlin Lowry was saying in my opening, that they will do one particular thing to try to help people out, when really it's just helping themselves feel better about their connection with Jesus, or feel like they get brownie points.
All right, and that's 5 minutes. All right, and we will reset the clock here. Ross, you good to go, my man?
Yep, good to go.
All right, I am starting your clock now.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'll try and address the points in order, starting from the opening statement. Hopefully I can get to something in the rebuttal. So the objection that missionaries are not concerned about the well-being, only adding to their saved cross notches. I totally agree that that's a thing. That is certainly something that is a real thing, and it's just bad theology. It's just bad morals. So I am completely on your side that is not something that a Christian missionary should be interested in. If they're not interested in the actual well-being of the person now and the well-being of the person in eternity, then then they're just in it for selfish things. So I would be with you in condemning them as individuals, though I don't know that it would necessarily be a motivation to ban Christian missionaries across the board. The abuse of a system isn't necessarily an argument against the system itself. The second thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned that evangelism is robbing them of their belief system, and it's destroying their culture, and it's making carbon copies of basically just American Christians. And while I guess I can see what you're saying about robbing them of their belief system, but obviously, if there is objective truth, which I think there is, then I think we would all want their belief system to be more true, right? That would be a good thing. If they believed more true things tomorrow than they did today, then that's a victory. And then destroying culture, hopefully I could address that a little bit in my opening statement, that I don't want to destroy culture. I want to transform culture. So I don't want to make them Americans. Or I want to make them Christians within their own context. And then try and get to some of the rebuttal. So the need to hear the gospel and not being concerned with their well-being, something I just would hit on again. I'm not a missionary. I wasn't the kid of a missionary either, but I donate a good chunk of my paycheck to missionaries whom I know personally, and the ones that I know are in it for both. They're in it for the well-being now. They want them healthy. They want them living in better communities. They want them safe. But they also want them to believe what the Christian missionaries are convinced is ultimately true. Which, if you were a Christian missionary, and you believe that at the end of history, that God was going to judge, and those who had not repented of their sins and trusted in Jesus for salvation were going to spend eternity in hell, how could you be a moral person and not go and tell everybody about that? Like, if that's what I think, never mind, I forget the magician's name, but he agrees with me on that one. But if you're really convinced that people in the world are going to spend an eternity in hell apart from all sources of happiness, and you don't do anything about it, you're not a good person. It's just kind of my opinion on that. One thing I didn't quite understand was when you were saying that all beliefs are not equal and that you agreed with me, but that it was a subjective statement. I didn't really understand the argument that you were making there, why the fact that I believe that Islam is not a good worldview to have. It doesn't represent, there are things that they believe about the person of Jesus or the afterlife, and things like that that aren't true. I don't know why that's necessarily subjective belief. Like, that's a statement about reality that's either true or false. I don't know why I don't see how it would be subjective. I'd be interested in more thoughts that you have on that. And just hitting on a couple more things here. The idea that we're saying that your way is worse than my way, that's certainly true. We are saying that your way is worse than my way. But I mean, you're saying that to me right now, like, and I totally respect where you're coming from. You're saying that my view of evangelism to the native tribes is not as good as your view of evangelism to the native tribes, and you're trying to change my mind, which I totally respect, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. But I think the postmodern notion of truth, I don't think is sustainable. I think it refutes itself.
Unmute for you guys to hear me. Sorry. So we're right on time there. We are now going to move to the discussion aspect. We're going to go for 30 minutes. So this, like I said, I think you guys will be able to have a good discussion. If I need to jump in, I will. But by telling so far, I think this will be good. So, all right, I'm going to reset this and set it for 30 minutes, guys. And you guys can go. I don't know who wants to start.
Well, since Ross just kind of went with some stuff, I could pose the first questions. So I didn't get a chance to hit on the ban being self-refuting. If we could touch on that real quick. You talk about how it's synonymous with wanting to ban people like spreading their ideas or ban the ability of people to try to change the minds of others. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm making that connection. Though, I mean, obviously that there are aspects of being a missionary to people in Papua New Guinea that aren't like being a missionary to people in New England. Like that, they're not exactly the same, but yeah, that element that they have in common.
Well, yeah, but do you understand how that's kind of like a false analogy there? Because it's not as clear cut as like me and Steve or Jerry are standing in the kitchen and we're having a philosophical debate on whatever topic, right? That's a far cry from going to remote portions of like Africa and using like medical assistance, using that in order to be able to tell them, oh hey, you should become a Christian. Like there's a really big difference between the two situations. For one thing, this is a completely other society. Like, I don't think that American Christians should go to like France and start proselytizing on the streets over there. If you want to change the society that you are in, that you call home, I think that that's perfectly fine, depending on the laws of your society. but I do think that it's wrong for you to leave your country and to force your way of life, your thinking on other people. So I'm wondering what do you have to think about that distinction?
So, as far as the medical care goes, if I was a Western missionary over in some nation or some people group that didn't have any access to adequate medical care, and I was only preaching the gospel to them, I was only trying to figure that out, but I wasn't, worried about their actual medical needs, which I have access to. I don't think I'd be kind of a jerk, if I have the ability to fundraise and to get you help, why wouldn't I? I'm certainly using that as, I can see what you're saying about using that in kind of a deceptive way. I get what you're saying, like talking to a child and, offering them a lollipop if they pray this prayer to Jesus. I get the issue there. And then the other thing I'd wonder if someone invited you, I don't know any people from France, but say I did, and I gave him your contact info, and he contacted you and was like, "Hey, we're having a conference in Paris, and we'd really like you to come there and talk about the benefits of using the scientific method to figuring out what's true." Would you go to France?
Well, I mean, if they were paying the way and everything like that, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'd love a trip to Paris, but also, do missionaries commonly get like collect calls from remote tribes in Africa and Australia to come and speak to them about the philosophy of Christianity?
A collect call. That's kind of a retro. I don't know if people do that anymore, but no. We usually Christian missionaries would usually be the ones, knocking on their door, so to speak.
I feel like you just low key said, "Okay, boomer."
Yeah.
No, no. Well, but my point is that my point is that it's not the culture or the people or somebody from within the society or culture that is wanting to push those ideas. These are people from outside of the culture that have not been invited in, that are coming in and being like, "Oh, hey, look, we've got this medicine here. You want some medicine? Also, you want to hear about Jesus Christ?" Like, you don't have to go that extra mile and say "Have you heard about Jesus Christ? Do you know that you're a broken person and you're going to be going to hell?" Like, you don't have to say that last bit. Like, you could just, there are, like I said, this is a nuanced thing because there are ways in which we can provide help to Indigenous peoples without like forcing our faith or forcing our influence on them. We could still help them do that. That's perfectly reasonable and commendable. But there are secular ways to do it where you don't end up destroying their culture. And I know that you talked about, which you can answer this next. You talked about you want to transform culture instead of destroy it. Well, when an outside force comes in and starts spreading this new idea and forcefully spreads this new idea, I don't mean like by punching people or anything like that. I just mean like you come in unasked, like nobody wanted your opinion on the afterlife or anything like that, but you come in and you're like, "Oh, hey, you're going to hell, buddy." You know that that is in fact destroying a faith, destroying a culture. So I'm wondering how do you see that as transformation and not destruction?
The point I was making about transformation and destruction is, I mean, cultures have been destroyed by missionaries. I completely agree with you. I mean, you can look at, the fact that there are more Presbyterians in Ghana than there are in Scotland tells you something about, about destroying culture. But it doesn't have to be done that way. The point I was making about transformation is that there should be Ghanaian, is that what they call them? Ghanaian Christians. Like, they should form Christian theology in their own context, answer their own questions. So like they deal with issues that Western Christians don't deal with. They have things like animism and polygamy, things that they have to deal with that we don't. So they would have their own theology in a way of speaking. So they would have their own language. They would have their they would have many beliefs that we don't, right? So I'm not saying that you have to believe exactly like I do. I'm saying is here are the fundamentals of the Christian faith which you should adopt. The rest is mostly up to you.
It's kind of interesting how you labeled polygamy as a bad thing. I mean, you've read about the Old Testament, right?
I have heard of it before, yes.
Okay. I'm mentioning that because, like, for instance, the founder of the Israelite people, Jacob, who got renamed by God to Israel, I mean, he participated in that. I mean, he had 2 wives that he worked 14 years for, and then he also had 2 servant girls that he also took as essentially wives. So, I mean, he had 4, and this is the founder of what would become your religion.
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer that question, but if you want to move on, that would be fine. We can, because this is kind of a side issue. But
yeah, it is.
If you read Genesis, every instance of polygamy ends up in just an awful time. The author of Genesis isn't advocating for polygamy. He's think about Jacob, for example. What were the brothers' relationships like with one another? I recall things like selling him into slavery, extreme jealousy because one was the favorite of the other. Sarah and Hagar would be another example of the failure of polygamy, of the conflict that they had within their family. Basically, every instance of polygamy in a narrative in the Torah ends in disaster. The narrator is trying to, or the author is trying to make a point that polygamy is a terrible thing. And once you move your way into the New Testament, there are conditions for elders to be a one-woman man and things like that. So by the time you get to the New Testament, the substandard of marriage, that is polygamy, is done away with by that point. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. We probably shouldn't dwell too much time on it.
Yeah, I don't want to get too off subject. Is there any question you had about my position? Because I kind of covered that last point. I have some other notes, but I don't want to dominate this discussion period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. You had some very interesting questions. So I guess I would like to ask you a little bit more. So you said you would go to Paris if they paid your board and your plane ticket, which I totally understand. Flights to Europe are not cheap. You would go there and talk about like the benefits of the scientific method and things like that, or so you would try and change, even though you're not a Frenchman. I think your Alabama accent would indicate otherwise. But even though you're not a Frenchman, you would be okay with going there and trying to change their way of thinking.
Well, I mean, I would go there to present like my ideas and everything because I was invited to be there, but I wouldn't come in there with the sole intent of changing people's minds. I like whenever I do my videos, I'm not out there to directly change people's minds. I'm putting my position out there so that it can get other people thinking.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask a little bit more too about your you said that it was a false analogy to compare like talking with I forget the gentleman's names in your kitchen, but whoever they were, and trying to go to people in Indonesia and talking to them about what the Christian message is and trying to get it translated into their language and all that kind of stuff. So what aspect of that was a false analogy?
Well, I feel like it was a false analogy because you're talking about discussing different ideas or trying to convince someone of your own society or your own community. Like it's change and discussion within the community. It's not an outside entity trying to change the community.
Mm-hmm. So you and I, for example, we're not exactly in the same cultural group. You're from the South. I'm from the Northeast. You have beliefs that are very different than mine. We do share a common language, which is helpful. What would be the difference between you and I, or what would be the similarity between you and I that couldn't also be achieved in an Indonesian indigenous people?
The internet?
The internet. That is helpful. Yeah, I
Well,
mean,
okay. By that, what I mean is that there's multiple different communities that are at work here. Okay, for one thing, both of us are part of the American community. We're in the same society. I mean, true, we're broken up by states, and each state has their own laws and all this other stuff. But essentially, I mean, we're still governed by one overarching government. So we're part of the same community. But also, we're part of this online internet community of people that are connected through the web, the internet. And so through that median, we can interact and spread ideas. Those are the ways in which we are connected. But how it differs from like the Indonesian people or any indigenous people is pretty much location and internet. Like if an Indonesian for somehow just pulled a phone out of thin air with Android on it and was able to connect through, I guess maybe God's Wi-Fi to get on the internet and interact with people online, then I would consider that particular person to be part of the internet community, and they are seeking out this information, or they are looking for information, so they're looking to be changed. That would be a change from within the community itself, and not like a outside entity looking to change the community.
Okay. Would you be in favor of some indigenous people, perhaps the one in northern India that you referenced earlier? Would you be in favor of supporting some kind of effort to get them internet access?
Wait, you're talking? Are you talking about the group that's nearly wiped out, or
the one where the missionary kid just was killed?
Oh, the Sentinelese people.
Yes.
I think they pretty much made it clear that they don't want any of our shit. So
Okay.
I don't think like I mean I would not support, like, for instance, I would not support the running of internet cable into their village and setting up some kind of internet or electrical system. That would be too much like culture shock to them. They wouldn't know how to use it. It would throw their entire society into disarray, and it would only do more damage than it could do good. What I would support is like that what was it? Amazon crap. It was a Amazon conservation team. What they do is they work with the local government in order to provide what these indigenous peoples need. They help to protect, and they also provide if necessary. And they do it in such a way to where they're minimizing whatever footprint they could possibly have on these indigenous people. So I would support efforts like that, not necessarily to get them internet or anything like that.
Okay. All right. I also probably should make clear that I don't want to, the idea of like forcing internet or anything like that on people is not something something I'm okay with.
Oh, I didn't take it that way. I took it as you like
Mhm.
proposing like, well, what if this were a possibility? Like I didn't
Right.
take that as you endorsing that necessarily.
Okay. So the culture shock would be one of the issues. But just trying to circle back to my original question, see if I can trace the line here. So the thing that made it a false analogy was the degree of difference between the cultures. Was that what it was?
Well, not the degree of difference between the cultures. It's where the change originates from.
Okay.
If it's originating from within the culture itself, I think it's perfectly fine. That's how cultures change. But if it's from an influence outside of the culture that the culture did not reach out for itself, then that would be the main difference there between the two.
Okay. All right. Do you have any more questions for me? I'm surprised we didn't really get into any of like the theological aspects of this.
Well, I mean, I didn't really feel like harping on the theological aspects too much because I disagree, which actually it did get brought up about when you were talking about Islam, about how, they believe in things that are factually untrue, like Jesus and what happens in the afterlife. I would say that neither of those things are objectively, not objectively, but absolutely, or in any way deemed to be facts. Like, your version of the afterlife is not a fact; it's an opinion. An opinion that you've been told, that you've been taught, just like Muslims have been told and taught their religion. And until they reach a point where they can try to determine their what they actually do believe, most likely they're just going to agree with their previous position. So, I mean, you think that those things are facts, like that Jesus rose from the dead. You think that's a fact. And I think that's fine if you want to think that's a fact. Does that mean that it's absolutely a fact? No. And that's one of the things that's kind of narcissistic about the evangelism issue, is that you think that all of your information in your holy book is a fact, when we have historical evidence that refutes a lot of your documents, like your Bible. Like, for instance, Abraham, Moses, Noah, all of them, they never existed in history. There's nothing to suggest that they weren't just made up by people, and then those particular documents where they were made up in were continuously redacted and meshed together in order to generate the Pentateuch. That is supported by real evidence. And so your Bible, your theological book, is not based on facts. It's based on opinions from 2,000 years ago. Well, between 2,000 and 4,000 or 6,000, however long ago. I mean, they're opinions from people that long ago. That's the most that you could probably say about those books.
Okay, so I think I jotted most of that down. So I probably wasn't clear enough when I was saying that the differences between Orthodox Christianity and Islam. I wasn't saying that they were facts necessarily. What I was saying was that they were, at least what I intended to say, was that they're mutually exclusive. They both can't be true. Believing that Jesus was crucified and that he wasn't crucified can't be both true at the same time. One of them is objectively true. Like, it has to be that either that he was crucified or that he wasn't. That's law of non-contradiction. So that's what I was saying. It's not that it's a subjective difference; it's that they can't both be true ideas. The other thing would be, I don't think it's narcissistic to believe what you believe is right. I mean, I imagine you believe what you believe is right about a lot of things. I don't know why I wouldn't call you a narcissist for that kind of thing. You believe that there's not enough evidence for Christianity or Islam or any of those kinds of things, and you think you're right about that. I don't think that's narcissistic. I just think that's your view, and you're entitled to it, and you're entitled to make a case for it.
Well, sorry if I can interject.
Yeah.
The narcissistic thing that I pointed out, which I can see this is a bit nuanced. The narcissistic thing is to think that you have the absolute truth and then want to go in and tell a foreign group of people that you have the absolute truth. This is what is absolutely true. You have to believe this, right? That is the narcissistic thing, is to think that you have the absolute truth and then to represent it as the absolute truth.
Do you think so? I assume you're saying that Christians don't have the absolute truth. Is that fair? You're saying that?
Yes.
Is that absolutely true?
No, I wouldn't say that that's absolutely true. I'm very much a subjectivist. I think that it's my subjective opinion that they're not absolute truths. That position is a bit nuanced too, because I do believe that there's an overarching absolute truth of reality, but I don't think that we can actually know that absolute truth ever. You would never be able to know when you've actually attained that absolute truth, because that's a restriction on the human experience. We'll never be able to know what absolutely happens in reality. We'll never be able to know that, and we have to come to terms with that. So I think the narcissistic point of view wouldn't necessarily be on me, because like with evolution, I think that evolution is well supported by facts. And it itself is a fact. We have seen it actually happen, and in those ways, it's as absolutely true as it can possibly be, and which would deviate from 100% absolutely true. I think that there's a difference in those two things.
I promise this is probably the last time I'll ask it, so I don't want to be I don't want to be Saikin Brugen Kate. Bless his heart. But when you're saying that there is absolute truth, overarching, but that we don't have access to it, but that the best that we can do is using the scientific method to test, empirical data. Those three things: overarching objective truth, or absolute truth. We can't get to it, but we can try our best with a scientific method. Is that absolutely true?
I would say no. That's not like I said before. I'm subjectivist, so I think that it's very much a subjective thing. But I would contend that nobody has the absolute truth, because we're all in common human. So like the restrictions on that I experience as a human are going to be the same restrictions that you experience as a human, unless you're some other kind of like race of beings that I guess doesn't have those kind of experiential restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you explain a little bit more what you said about that? Historians or scientists or whatever has demonstrated that Abraham and Noah and people like that never existed.
Oh yeah, totally. So the common Christian view is that the Pentateuch was written by Moses, right? But there's no way that can be true because of the different writing styles. The most likely thing is that it was written documentary style. You have multiple different documents that were then kind of cobbled together. But the archaeological evidence that supports the idea that what's given in the Bible is not actually true is the fact that we have found ruins of early Israelite settlements that do not indicate the time that the settlements are dated to are not reflective of what's in the Bible. And it's actually been shown that the Israelites were Canaanites that broke off from the Canaanites and then grew in number, and then I guess eventually overtook the Canaanites or something like that, which in the Old Testament, it says that the Israelites destroyed, I believe, all of the Canaanites, but we've actually been able to find descendants of Canaanites now. So, I mean, we have massive amounts of archaeological evidence that do not corroborate what's said in the Old Testament, and nothing in the Old Testament actually is corroborated by any of the archaeological evidence. So that there's no reason, like there's no concrete reason to accept that Abraham, Noah, Moses, all of them were real. Like as far as Moses goes, like there was no great exodus out of Egypt. There was never the amount of Jewish slaves in Egypt that the Bible purports there to be. Just none of all of the wars of Joshua and all of that, they didn't happen, at all like the Bible represents them. So you got to understand, with like no evidence to support what's actually in the Bible, it's in the Old Testament, then there's no reason to suggest that they were actually real people if you can't actually substantiate that with any kind of evidence.
So it would be one thing to say that we can't prove that someone like Noah existed, and it's another thing to say that it's been proven that they never existed. Those would be two different statements. I would agree with the first. We can't prove through historical means or archaeology that Noah ever existed. I grant that. I certainly grant that. Right?
Well, I mean, I didn't say that all of that proves that they didn't exist. I said that, or at least what I meant to say was that without any corroborating evidence, there's no reason to consider them to have been real people when there's nothing to suggest that they actually were.
Okay, so you're saying that the evidence is lacking, the archaeological evidence or the textual evidence itself is lacking to support the historical claims of the Old Testament or things like that.
Right.
That'll be a very interesting talk for another time, especially the multiple authors of the Torah, for example. That'd be a really interesting conversation.
Oh yeah, we can definitely go over that. I'm a mythicist too, so you can have fun with that as well.
Boy. Okay, yeah, that'd be interesting. I'd be down for that.
Okay, how much time do we have, Skylar?
We got about 2 minutes left.
2 minutes.
2.5 minutes.
Okay, not a lot of time to really ask you a question. I do. I think it was Penn that you were talking about earlier with the magician who thinks that Christians should definitely tell other people that they're going to hell.
Penn. Yeah.
Huh?
I couldn't remember his first name.
Yeah, it's Penn.
Last name.
Or well, maybe it's Penn, because Teller's the one that never talks. So it'd be Penn, Penn Jillette. So I mean, I can understand that point of view, but again, it goes back to the kitchen discussion. You're talking about spreading your ideas within your own culture and society, and not like interacting with a foreign culture or society that did not ask for your opinion, basically.
Okay. So you were saying about the Penn example of that. I wonder what his thoughts would be on the Indigenous peoples thing. Unfortunately, I don't know Penn, so I can't ask him. But yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced by the distinction that you're making between traveling somewhere where they not. I want to agree again that forcing beliefs on people isn't helpful or isn't moral, right? Like going there and forcing people to become Christians. It's a dick move. But I think that if you go there and try to convince them with evidence or with things like that, I don't see anything wrong with that. Now, if they say leave, like I could to Mormon missionaries who come over, I think they should leave, right? If they don't want them there anymore. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with Mormon missionaries coming to my house and trying to get me to believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet and that I can become a god one day with my own planet. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, even though they're from a different culture or whatever that might be.
Okay, and sorry, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we got about 30 seconds, but I don't know if you guys want to say anything else.
No.
Now let's move on to closing statements. Is Ross going to go first this time, or I don't? Makes no difference to me. Whatever you feel more comfortable with.
I think it generally goes with whoever opens doesn't close, right?
Yeah, I think it'll probably be affirmative, negative, that kind of thing.
Right. So yeah, I'll go first in my closing statements.
Fantastic. All right. Wait 1 second. You guys have made this a very easy debate to moderate, by the way. I am literally glued to the New Hampshire primary results, so I'm sorry. I've been listening, but not as detailed as I should be. Anyways, all right. It's a close race if you guys aren't following out there. All right. We are starting now.
All right. Okay, so I still am very firmly in the idea that Christians should be banned or restricted from evangelizing to Indigenous peoples, mainly because of the real world effects that they have on them, but also because of the fact that I would say that most missionaries and evangelicals are not concerned with their well-being. I know that Ross disagrees with this particular notion now, but I mean, it's pretty evident in the actions of missionaries and evangelicals whenever they go and they proselytize to people, because they don't go there and proselytize, or they don't go there to just help out. And then like the people ask them about what they believe. They go there specifically so that they can provide their particular religion as the correct way to live. And that itself is what is narcissistic, to go into a culture from outside the culture and change that culture to your culture or your way of thinking because you think that it's the correct way to do it. That's what's narcissistic. But also we see these cultures that have been invaded by missionaries and evangelicals change in devastating ways. Their economic systems are exploited, like with like with the one group of people who became dependent on Western goods. These indigenous peoples are easily exploitable, either through uneducation or ignorance. I think that missionaries see this particular weakness and they prey upon it. They go there and they think, oh, this is somebody that I can convince rather easily because they don't know any better. And I think that the effects that they have in that, like with Liberia, the entire country changed, not because there was some, United States representative that was there pointing out, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this. It was because missionaries came in, spread their gospel, set up schools, taught them how to read and everything using their particular faith and their particular way of life. And it affected them in such a way that it drastically changed their entire country to be a carbon copy of the United States. And just like what we heard from Caitlin Lowry, is that a lot of these missionary and evangelical mission trips have a single thing in mind, like a single thing to do. Let's say you got a mission trip where there's the single thing that they're going to do is they're going to go to this place and they don't have any running water. So what are we going to do? We're going to build a system that will bring them fresh water so that they don't have to get buckets and go down to the river, get the water and bring it back up. We're just going to go, we're going to do that. And that's going to be it. And then we're going to convince people of Jesus and then we're going to jet on out of there. That does not provide any kind of long-lasting infrastructure. That does not provide anything to that particular tribe that somebody that with a better understanding of how that tribe operates and what is best for that tribe to help them to come in and do. Like, these people will go in and do something helpful just so that they can get their foot in the door with telling them about Jesus, because that is the paramount concern of an evangelical or missionary, is to convert people to their religion and to push their way of life on them. And by their way of life, I don't mean like running down to the 7-Eleven and getting a Diet Coke. What I mean is their way of life, meaning their belief system. They're pushing their belief system on these people. Regardless of how good you think your particular belief system is, it's not necessarily good for that society or culture, because you're going in half-cocked and you think that you're doing what's best for these savages so that you can bring them to civilization or you can have them act in a civilized manner. But that kind of culture shock only devastates the culture. It doesn't help them whatsoever. And also, another point to bring up is the fact that the diseases are spread. Diseases that these indigenous peoples would have never had contact with. They get brought there. Nobody knows that they're bringing these diseases. And then they do their one project and then they leave. They put the notches on their crosses and they go. And what happens? Over 50% of a tribe, or nearly 50% of a tribe, dies because missionaries wanted to preach the gospel to them.
And that's time. All right. So we'll give you the last word.
Oh,
And
sorry,
you are
sorry,
good to
Sky.
go.
Oh, sorry, Skylar. Can you pause?
Yep. Yeah, you good. Please.
Yeah, well, I was just going to remind the chat real quick that if you want to ask any questions or anything like that, that we can discuss, super chats are going to get priority. So be sure to ask any questions that you might have had that we didn't get a chance to cover, or you didn't get I didn't ask, or Ross didn't ask. Be sure to do those. Super chats are the best way to do it. We may take one or two that are not super chats, but the only way to guarantee that it'll be asked in the live stream is to do a super chat. So, okay, that's all. That's my spiel. You go ahead.
Oh, no, that's perfect. I should have brought that up anyways. All right, Ross, I'm going to go ahead and start the clock, and you are good to go. Oh, Ross, you're muted, buddy. We restart
Great.
that.
Okay,
That's
great.
all right. We're set. You're good. Good and go, my man.
All right. Yeah, I just want to say again, thanks so much to John and to Skylar, for having this kind of thing. It's been a great discussion. Very civil, very respectful. So I really appreciate that. It was a good, important conversation to have. And then just picking up on the last thing that John mentioned, the diseases issue. I certainly agree that the missionaries who are coming in, like the 82nd Airborne, and they're there for a week or two, and then they jet out. That's irresponsible. The shock that you can create and the diseases that you could leave behind you don't even know. Whatever the issue could be, I think that's certainly irresponsible. Missionaries who aren't committed to the long-term, well-being of people aren't really, they're not doing a good job. But I mean, it's very likely that the indigenous peoples already have many diseases. The Sawi people that I mentioned in my opening statement would be a perfect example. They had hepatitis, malaria. Their survival rate among infants was terrible. The Western Christians who came in fixed many of those problems, provided medicine that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So the diseases issue is kind of a give and take sort of thing with that. But the point certainly taken. Irresponsible missionaries are bad for everyone. I completely agree. However, the fact that there have been irresponsible missionaries and the conquistadors and the people who have gone into Ghana and all those sorts of things in Liberia, totally granted all of that sort of thing. Contemporary Christian evangelism or Christian missionary evangelism isn't really anything like that. If you take any major seminary textbook on missiology or global missions or anything like that, all of them preach against this kind of thing. They all say, be in there for the long haul, raise up leaders from within. That's your goal. And you're trying to create a thriving culture with the bad parts removed and the good parts, created from Christianity itself. The Sawi example that I mentioned, how treachery of one's enemies was a prized virtue. It isn't anymore, right? Christian missionaries fixed that problem. And again, I just wanted to emphasize that, barging your way into a community, forcing your beliefs on them is not a thing that I'm advocating. It's not a thing that any major missiologist would think of advocating either. And that is a failure. So just to summarize everything from there, I still stand by my objection to the ban that it's self-refuting. I don't buy the category distinction that's being made between the distance of the culture. That it's okay for John and I to have a conversation, or John to have a YouTube page where he's trying to share his point of view, right, in such a way as hopefully it sounds convincing. That there's a major category distinction between that and us traveling to Indonesia and teaching them the wonderful things that the West has figured out about science and that kind of thing. I don't think you can avoid being narrow-minded, right? I think everybody is narrow-minded. We all have our point of view. We all have our worldview, and we, by nature, think it's correct, or else we wouldn't have it. I believe that objective truth can be known through revelation, through the scriptures, and John believes it can't be known, but the best that we can do is through the scientific method. We both think we're right about that. John may not think he has absolute knowledge of that, but he certainly thinks he's right about that and would prefer if other people would adopt that, if I'm not speaking for him incorrectly. And then and the political issues, I think, still are a thing. I think it restricts the freedom of religion. And lastly, I just wanted to reemphasize the Christian message. the reason that missionaries go to indigenous peoples isn't to get it shouldn't be to get another notch in their belt. It should be actual concern for people whom they're convinced are going to spend an eternity apart from God, apart from all sources of happiness, and that the only way to fix that is through faith in Christ.
All right, that's right at 5 minutes, and we will move on to the Q&A section. I don't think I saw any super chats, unfortunately, from the audience, but we do have some questions already. This is coming from what is the name of the group? This is your atheist. I don't want to say it.
Yeah, so it's the Skeptic Mafia, which there's actually
Skeptic
right
Mafia.
below me. There's a little sort of advert kind of thing to join the Skeptic Mafia. It's the memberships here on the channel. You get like an extra podcast every week. You get different things, that you can that add to the entertainment of the GE channel. You also get to vote on videos that we cover, and you get to vote on different things. And tonight, I allow the Skeptic Mafia to submit their own comments and questions for both of us, and this is what they came up with, which were mostly questions for Ross.
All
So.
I'll read the first one out here. This might be a little loaded, this first question.
Yeah.
Please explain to us, this is for Ross, how a spiteful, vengeful, narcissistic, vain God has any right to be judging the morals of man.
Oh boy. So it's from a group called the Skeptic Mafia. Is that right? Okay, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess I would ask. What would be is it an objectively bad thing to be spiteful or mean or whatever other adjectives were attributed to God? Is that an objectively bad thing? If it's not, then there's obviously no problem within your worldview that would disqualify such a being from judging anyone. If that's your opinion, that's fine. But if that's not objectively true, then I don't think you've said a whole lot. But for my view as a Christian, I don't believe that God is spiteful or mean or any of those kind of things. I think he's holy, and I think he's loving, which is why he will judge sinners for sinning, and why he will extend grace to people who don't deserve it. So holy and loving is what I would say, not spiteful and mean.
Right. So God has. Do you recall at all what happened to the two priests? I believe that were Aaron's sons in the Old Testament. Do you recall what happened to them?
I think they offered up. They were basically trying to subvert the priesthood authority with Aaron and Moses, and they're like, "Hey, we're going to do our own incense and stuff like that. We're gonna, And then God opened up probably a very cool movie scene. Opened up like the ground, and they got all swallowed up.
Oh, so, no, that's not the incident that I'm talking about. Those were a different group of people, not Aaron's sons.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Aaron's sons, they got the wrong incense or fire, tribute fire, and so God lit them on fire. So I'm just kind of curious, like how is that not kind of mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean they had. So I would point this out. Within the Christian conception of God's holiness, any sin would be deserving of eternal punishment against a holy God, and it's kind of a bad sin because he literally just told them, "This is how I want you to do the sacrificial system." Like they saw God like a few weeks beforehand and all that kind of stuff, and then they went and did their own thing. Certainly, the text doesn't give the hint that it was an accident, right? Doesn't give them the text doesn't give the feeling that they did it by mistake. It would seem to point that they chose to do it a different way than God had said. So, in other words, it was rebellion that God was squashing. But yeah, you're right. I think I was confusing that with the rebellion of Korah, against Moses and Aaron. So
Okay. So like if somebody doesn't do a baptism correctly, right? They maybe, I don't know. Do you think that they just have to be sprinkled with water, or do you think they have to be like fully like power slammed into the water?
power slammed. Yeah, I'd definitely be on the power slam side of that equation.
Okay.
Although I
So-
don't think that there's the category distinction I would make is there's not the same kind of clarity in the New Testament about the sacrament of baptism as there was, literally 2 weeks beforehand. God said, "This is how I want you to do everything," and then they decided to do it their own way. And also, people baptizing in the various ways aren't doing it out of willful disobedience. They're doing it because they think they're doing the best that they can.
Well, I guess that kind of depends on the perspective, right? Because the first ones to say, "Oh no, you just got to sprinkle them a little bit with the water and they're baptized," like the first ones to do that. I mean, I'm sure that the existing Christian authority or Christian community was like, "That's heresy, my friend." So, I mean, you can understand how that just seems to be like a perspective issue. I mean, I don't see if there's anything like I don't recall anything in the Bible that says that Aaron's sons were like, "Hey, you know what? Fuck that God guy. We're just going to use this different candle over here." Like they didn't do that in the Bible. They just used different incense or candles or whatever in the world they lit. They offered it up incorrectly, whether accidental or not. Do you think they should have spontaneously combusted?
Well, probably. I mean, I wouldn't go about spontaneously combusting people if I gave them something to do, but I'm not God. So,
can you give me a list of
baptism for the issue of baptism? There was a lot more fluidity in the early church as far as like baptismal things like that. It wasn't as dogmatic a thing as it is today. There were certainly like full tub immersions for adults to be baptized in. That was certainly a thing. The word baptize in Greek means to be immersed. So there is that, but it was a tradition that developed over a long period of time where you get to the infant baptism with sprinkling and all that kind of stuff. So it's not the same kind of issue as, direct disobedience, which I would still submit is what the text implies about the sons of Aaron offering a different way than God had instructed them.
Let's go on to the next question because you guys could probably debate this topic all day long.
Thanks,
no
Skylar.
one would watch that title. Yeah.
All right. So we got a question for Godless Engineer. So let's do that next. At Godless Engineer, is religion an addiction issue?
I don't think necessarily that it's an addiction issue. I think that some people could possibly behave in a way that's similar to addiction, because definitely anything that would I guess stimulate your the different chemicals in your brain that make you happy, make you feel good. Obviously, those things can be abused, and religion often does get abused, and it can be addictively abusive. So I think that it definitely can be, I guess, but I don't think that religion is inherently like that way. Like anybody that is religious has an addiction kind of connection. I think like with anything else, it can become toxic.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was saying
did
Ross says, yeah, I should let Ross say
I
if you
pretty
have
much agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. All right. This is for you, Ross. Why does shit happen as much to good people as to bad people?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not an advocate
Age-old
of.
question here.
Oh yeah. Shit happening. Right. Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't be an advocate of like retribution theology or anything like that. I mean, I think that's pretty well refuted in the Old Testament by books like Habakkuk and Job, discussing the problem of evil. That's not a biblical idea. While there is a general principle that you can find in Deuteronomy or in Proverbs of if you live this good life, generally speaking, it's going to go better for you than otherwise. Proverbs still recognizes the fact that the wicked people prosper and bad things happen to good people. So the showing my theological pinstripes here, I believe that, so I'm a Calvinist, so I believe Romans 8:28, that all things, good and bad, happen for the glory of God and for the good of those whom he has called according to his purpose. So even the bad things, God is working out for the good of his people, right? Even though it seems in the moment that they kind of suck, and they do really suck. I don't mean to, I haven't suffered as much as some people, but I can certainly say that suffering sucks. But it is being used by God for the ultimate good, is what I would say.
So, I'm kind of curious how you distinguish between judgment of God and just, you know, I guess just bad things happening. Do you think it's all judgment of God?
No, I would probably flip it the reverse. So every good thing that happened, tends to happen, would be God's grace. So undeserved kindness. And every bad thing is more a passive action on God's part. Um, so that's to set up the idea that God doesn't owe us a good life. God doesn't owe us, promotion in our jobs if we, remember to call our grandmother on her birthday, that kind of thing. It's not an idea of karma. So I would switch around the other way, that every good thing that happens to us is God's grace, and every bad thing that happens to us is, that's just part of being fallen human beings in a fallen world.
So let me, is it okay, John, if I ask a question to
Yeah,
you?
definitely.
We don't have another question. I know I'm the moderator, but this will be nothing too controversial. I know that the topic of this tonight's debate was, is it ever basically okay to evangelize to Indigenous people? Do you feel there's ever a situation where it's okay to evangelize to anybody when it comes to religion?
Well, yeah, I think there are times, but it would be restricted, kind of like in the kitchen analogy that we've been discussing. I think it's perfectly fine for people to evangelize in their own society. I think that it's perfectly okay for people to ask for others to come in from the outside of the society and evangelize within their community, because then, while it's not the person in the community doing it, it is the person in the community that is wanting those ideas to be spread in the community. Also, now we have the internet, and so people are connected in ways that we never thought about. And so through the internet, I'm fine with people evangelizing. What I'm not okay with is like people being assholes about it, I guess, like the street preachers that you see where they scream at people that they're going to hell and they need to repent, turn to Christ, and just harassing people. Like, I don't agree with that. I'm perfectly fine with Mormons and I guess JWs knocking on doors and asking people if they've heard about Jesus, which, living in America, I'm surprised they still ask, do you know about Jesus? Literally everybody knows about Jesus in America. So yeah, I think it can be fine, but it's a very nuanced position.
It's definitely not effective, I would say, to yell at somebody. It's like when people yell at women at abortion clinics. I'm like, I don't know if that's going to get them to stop. Like, probably try a different approach. Ross, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, certainly Mormons would be a good example. I certainly think they should be allowed, even though they're from the West Coast. And actually, I've had I've had one missionary from Guam come over and talk to me for a while, knock on my door and all that kind of stuff, and a couple others from an island culture, actually, which is kind of interesting. I certainly think that they should be allowed to knock on however many doors they want, just as I believe that I should be able to go to their island culture and, I don't know, I was going to say knock on huts, but I guess it's a little racist. I don't know if they have huts or not. So, yeah, I certainly believe that forcing your way into people's houses or environments is bad and is wrong. However, asking them, hey, do you want to talk about what I believe is true? and I want to help you out. Like let's have an actual relationship where we can talk about what's real and what's true, and I can help you out with the medicine that I have. So I think there's nothing wrong with that, and that should be allowed for Mormons and for evangelical Christians.
Well, if I can ask a question real quick,
Yep.
of Ross, how do you feel? How would you feel about, like, let's say a Muslim missionary, if one were to exist, going to an indigenous people and spreading the faith of Islam, or bringing it closer to home? What if somebody invited a Muslim into your church to speak about the truth of Islam?
It would depend. So first, I think if I'm remembering that correctly, I would not want any legislation preventing Muslim missionaries, which I'm not sure if that's actually a thing, but it's a conceivable thing for sure. I would not want any legislation preventing that. I think that they should be free to do that. And then coming into my church, it wouldn't be appropriate on like a Sunday morning, but certainly to have like a debate or to have like a conversation or something like that, I'd be all for that. I think that would be great to have that kind of. I would be more than happy to have them come to me. In other words, that saves me the trip across town.
Okay. Well, what about in public schools?
To have like
Muslims or people just of other faiths in general talking about the truth value of their particular religion.
It's a little complicated for me since I'm not a big believer in public government-sponsored education. I'm more of the privatized education kind of guy. I think it's just but that's a political conversation for another time. I just think the government tends to ruin everything, and getting them involved in our education, which, I mean, you can't find the word education in the Constitution, for example. It's not part of the federal government's job. But in any event, given the private education, I'd be more than happy with them coming and expressing their point of view, and then having someone else come and express their point of view. I think that'd be a good thing.
Okay.
All right, let's do this last question we have, because I want to make sure we get this in. This is from, actually, I don't know who it's from specifically, but it's from the group we'd mentioned earlier. What would happen to them if they had never heard of the correct faith? Is God really so evil as to condemn someone who hasn't had the chance to learn about him? If he isn't, why evangelize and put them at risk of being sent to hell?
So there certainly are people who think Christianity. William Lane Craig would be a good example. John just uploaded a video, I think yesterday, responding to someone who would say that, well, it actually depends. The person who doesn't ever hear the gospel, well, they could still be saved. And I think that John pointed out some very valid flaws in that argument. So I am not of the opinion that a person who never hears the gospel, in this age, that they have any way to be saved apart from that. I think the New Testament is pretty clear on that. The justice in that would be that, well, so I'm a Calvinist, right? I have the big C on the name tag in my shirt. So I believe that given 1,000 chances, the unregenerate person will never accept the gospel. They'll never be convinced of the truth value of it. They'll never gladly submit. They'll never gladly repent, that kind of thing. It's not something that a fallen human being is capable of doing, which would be the distinction between myself and someone like William Lane Craig. The only way that someone would come to have an actual, organic, real relationship with Jesus in a saving kind of way would be God's. I think the biblical imagery is taking out a heart of stone and putting in a heart of flesh. New birth, regeneration. Those are the biblical words used to describe the process, and that is only accompanied by the preaching of the gospel, which is made clear in the New Testament. So, and that is not something that God owes anyone. That's not something. That gift on his behalf is not something that we can say that, God, you should have done that to me, a sinner who has sinned against you my entire life. I I owe that much from you. No, the Bible describes that as grace. It's an undeserved kindness that God does out of His grace and His mercy. So I'm sure that John won't have anything to say in response to that. I'm sure he agrees 100% with that.
Well, the only question that I have is the fact that we don't determine, like, we don't have control over what convinces us, right? At least that's how I view it. So since we don't have control over what convinces us, does that mean that God creates people specifically so that He can burn them in hell for eternity?
I'm not sure I get the connection between the two ideas, but so the issue isn't a intellectual one when I'm saying an unregenerate person can't. It would probably be more accurate not to say that the unregenerate person can't be convinced of arguments, evidential arguments of the resurrection and that kind of thing. It's rather that the unregenerate person cannot gladly repent and love God and love His law and that kind of thing. Can't turn from someone who disregards God to someone who loves God, right? Loves obeying Him and following Him. So that wouldn't be an issue of being convinced or an evidential argument or anything like that. That would be a moral issue, an issue of the heart. So, and then I'm not sure how, since I disagreed with the intellectual aspect of it, I'm not sure how we would get from that to.
I mean, I didn't specifically say the intellectual value or aspect of anything. I was just talking about the fact that we don't control what convinces us. Like, if you want to, like, if we were to have a discussion on morality and you wanted to try to convince me of a position, I don't control if it convinces me or not. Like, I don't know anybody that could be convinced that something is true and then, knowingly reject it as true or reject it in some way like that. So it just seems to me like God specifically creates people that can't be convinced. So therefore He creates them so that they can eventually go to hell.
Right. So when you're saying convinced, it sounds more like an analysis of evidence. That's more what I'm hearing when I hear convinced.
You're presenting your argument, and I would say that the argument is evidence, and so the person is evaluating your argument or evidence to see if it's convincing and whether or not it's convincing. Like, you would have to, me being an atheist, you would have to convince me that your particular God exists. And I don't control if I'm convinced by a certain piece of evidence.
Mm-hmm. And then to tie back with what I was saying, if I could convince you now that, like, that Jesus was a real person, He wasn't a myth, and that He really did the things He did, and that God exists, and all that kind of stuff, would you then come to church on Sunday and worship God?
Knowing what I know about God, and you convince me that your particular God exists, I would not deny. See, these are two different questions. I wouldn't deny that He exists anymore, but I also wouldn't worship Him. But that's not really the position of any atheist, like, out there. Like, no, there's no atheist out there that accepts that God exists, that your particular God exists, and then willfully is in rebellion of Him, even though, like, He says all of these things. If He said all those things, made all of those declarations, and had all of those laws, and was like, you're going to burn in hell for it, then I would knowingly choose hell over serving Him.
Right. So I think that gets to, so it's not a matter of accepting arguments. Like, it's not a philosophical matter or an evidential matter. It's one of the heart, like what your affections are, what you love and what you don't love.
Well, no. I mean, I just laid out 2 steps that you have to take, and you're acting like I'm the Hulk and I'm jumping 2 steps. I'm not jumping 2 steps. Like, I'm not in a position where I'm, just rejecting outright, like, God's law over me. I'm not convinced that this God exists, for one. and then multiple steps later, actually, you prove that it's your particular God that exists, and then at that particular hypothetical point in the future is when the situation you're talking about arises. But as of yet, like I'm all the way at the bottom of the stairs, and you're thinking that I can just magically jump to the very top of the stairs.
Oh yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. I think probably this would be helpful to point out. What makes someone a Christian, an actual Christian, isn't believing that God exists or believing that Jesus was who he said he was and he rose again from the dead. The thing that turns someone from, someone interested in religion and an actual Christian is regeneration, something, the changing of your affections. So you can, if I could convince you, like I was saying before, if I could convince you that God exists and that Jesus was the Messiah, you still wouldn't be a Christian, which I think would also be a difference between someone like myself and William Lane Craig.
Yeah, I mean, I would identify that as a no true Scotsman fallacy, but I think we've taken up Skylar's time enough tonight. I do have a super chat that's not exactly a question; it's more of a statement.
This was a pleasure. So don't. It's not a big deal. I've had fun.
Okay, so it's Joni Spinoza who says, "If God showed Himself to me, I'd acknowledge His existence, but would never worship Him because He's an evil POS." And I mean that would be pretty similar to my position. I thank you, Joni, for your super chat. But like I said, that current situation doesn't exactly exist, so there's no way that you can claim that any one atheist is in that position. But this is another debate for another time. But I do want to say thank you to Skylar for moderating tonight. You were so awesome. Thank you, Ross, for coming and having the discussion with me. I could tell that you're very good at conversation in general. So hopefully we can set up another thing sometime in the future, and we can debate some other topic, maybe mythicism or the historicity of the Old Testament or something like that. I'm much better with those particular topics. So. Everybody, if you will, please leave a comment down below with your thoughts on this question and this conversation in general. I have both Skylar and Ross linked in the description now, so definitely hit up those links. Go and subscribe to him. Skylar does almost nightly shows where he discusses really important things. He reviews videos. He does a lot of great stuff with Dr. Josh Bowen and sometimes by himself during the day and such. So he does a lot of great content over there. Ross also has a YouTube channel. If you're on Ross's side, definitely go and check out Ross's content. I know he'd appreciate it. So thank you two again tonight for the debate, and I guess we'll be seeing all of you heathens later. And the non-heathens out there. And I guess we're going to go ahead and stop now. So y'all have a nice night. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and all that kind of good stuff. And we will see you heathens later.